Hello everyone, and welcome to this video. In this video, we'll be considering the following topic: symmetry in animals and anatomical planes. Let's begin. Let's first talk about spherical symmetry. When you hear the word spherical symmetry, what word comes to your mind? Well, the word that comes to my mind would be a sphere. Now, what objects do you know that has a spherical shape? Well, let's think about a basketball or a soccer ball or football. Those shapes, or those objects, I should say, are spherical in nature. And that is a good place to start when we're thinking about the idea of spherical symmetry. So what is spherical symmetry by definition? Well, spherical symmetry is a body arrangement in which any plane that passes through the center of the organism divides it into two identical mirror image halves. So when we're talking about spherical symmetry, we're talking about a body arrangement in which any plane, it doesn't matter what plane we're talking about, any plane that passes through the center, but the plane has to pass through the center, that same plane is going to divide this body into two identical mirror image halves. So let's consider this picture or this diagram. Notice that we have this plane in blue. This is only one plane that we have being shown. But remember, it doesn't only work for this particular plane. Any plane that passes through the center, right, will work. All right. When I say will work, I mean that it will divide the body into two identical mirror image halves. It's just like how this does. So if you look at this blue plane passes through the center, right, passes through the center of this sphere, and it divides it into two identical mirror image halves. This is the idea when we're talking about spherical symmetry. Once you understand this, you will understand spherical symmetry. But remember, this is only one plane that we're talking about. But, at least in this particular picture. But remember, it works for any plane. All right? So for spherical symmetry to work, the body has to be arranged in such a way that any plane that I take that passes through the center of the organism is going to split it into two identical mirror image halves. All right, so let's look at some other properties of spherical symmetry. Well, in spherical symmetry, the body has the shape of a sphere, and the body parts are evenly arranged around the center or spread outward from the center. What else do we know about spherical symmetry? With animals that have spherical symmetry, they don't have a definite front or a definite back or top or bottom because it's basically shaped like a ball. All right, so this symmetry is associated with very simple body organization, such as certain unicellular organisms. So this specific type of symmetry, spherical symmetry, is associated with, we're talking about simple organisms, right? Simple body organization. So for example, multicellular organisms, such as humans, right? We do not have spherical symmetry. We have a different type of symmetry, but not spherical symmetry. Human beings, wolves and mammals, right? We don't shape like a ball, right? So we have a more complex arrangement, right? But this symmetry is associated with very simple body organization, such as certain unicellular organisms like heli, ozo, aya, and radiolaria. It can also be found in volvox, simple multicellular green algae. So when it comes to spherical symmetry, this is rare, right? Spherical symmetry is rare, and it's found in simple organisms, right? So we're talking about the green algae, we're talking about certain unicellular organisms. So it's mainly found in simple body organization, right? Because if you look at it, there's no definite front, there's no definite top, there's no definite front, there's no definite back, there's no definite bottom. So this type of body arrangement is good because it facilitates floating around. So as you can see in the background picture, we have these green algae, they're floating around. All right, so this particular body arrangement helps with floating around. Okay, so let's look at some pictures about spherical symmetry. So this right here is an example of an organism that has spherical symmetry. And this one is also another example of an organism that has spherical symmetry. This is showing different photos of the same thing, volvox, simple multi-grain algae. And remember, with spherical symmetry, it's a body arrangement whereby any plane that passes through the center of this organism will divide it into two identical halves. All right. So here we have another example. We have heliozoia. This is another example of spherical symmetry. And here is another example of also spherical symmetry. Remember, for spherical symmetry, we can take any plane. Once that plane passes through the center, it's going to divide that organism into two identical mirror image halves. That's the idea with spherical symmetry. Okay, let's move on to radial symmetry. Now, for radial symmetry is a body arrangement in which an animal can be divided into equal halves by several planes passing through a central axis. So with radial symmetry, we have a central axis involved. All right. So let's look at some examples. Oh, well, before we get to the examples, let's look at some certain features of radial symmetry. Well, animals with radial symmetry possess distinct upper and lower surfaces, but they lack left and right sides. What else do we need to know about radial symmetry? Well, this type of symmetry allows interaction with the environment from all directions. Now let's look at some pictures, and because pictures are good, pictures help me to understand this topic, and I'm sure it's going to help you as well. So this is an example of radial symmetry. Here's another example of radial symmetry. So we could find it in plants. All right. We can also find it in animals. Remember, for radial symmetry, it's a body arrangement in which an animal can be divided into equal halves by several planes passing through a central axis. So we could find it in plants, right? We can also find it in animals as well, like the starfish, the coral polyp, and the sand dollar. Okay, let's go on to look at some other examples of where we can find radial symmetry. And I like to give pictures because pictures give you a visual understanding of what's going on, and hopefully it is helpful for you. So this right here is Hydra, and we have shown that it has radial symmetry. Also, sea anemone has radial symmetry, and also the starfish has radial symmetry. Now let's look at bilateral symmetry. Now bilateral symmetry is very easy because bilateral symmetry is a body arrangement in which an animal can be divided into two identical halves by a single plane. So insects that exhibit bilateral symmetry are the following. We have butterfly, ladybug, bee, and beetle. Notice that we have a single plane. Again, a single plane. All right. So this is literally the same definition, but we're looking at this one. This is also an insect, and we have a single plane. Again, it's a body arrangement in which an animal can be divided into two identical halves by a single plane. Now, when you look at this picture, if you have done line symmetry in mathematics, this is literally a line of symmetry, right? This is a line that cuts the image into two identical halves. So you could think about that. If you're familiar with line of symmetry in maths, you could think about that when we're looking at bilateral symmetry. Very easy. It's going to divide the object or the organism into two identical halves by a single plane. So let's look at some features of bilateral symmetry. So animals with bilateral symmetry have a distinct left and right sides. Look at this butterfly in the background. Bilateral symmetry. It has bilateral symmetry, as well as a defined anterior and posterior end. This symmetry supports directional movement and cephalization. Let's go. So we already saw this picture before. This shows insects that exhibit bilateral symmetry. Obviously, the butterfly, the ladybird, the bee, and the beetle. All right, now let's talk about the planes. So let's begin with the frontal plane. Now, what the frontal plane is going to do is actually a vertical plane. Now, when we say vertical, we're talking about up and down. Horizontal is left to right, but vertical is up and down. So the frontal plane is a vertical plane that divides the body into anterior. Now, anterior is going to be front, and posterior is going to be back. So the frontal plane is a vertical plane, right? That means it goes up and down, right? And it's going to divide the body into a front and back, or anterior and posterior portions. So when you think about the frontal plane, think about a plane that is going to split or divide the body into front and back. All right. So this is a good example. Like I said, pictures are really good when it comes to these things. So we call it the frontal plane, or we call it the coronal plane. So it's going to be a vertical line, like we said, a vertical line, all right, up and down. That's going to divide the body into the anterior, which is the front part, and the posterior to the back part. So we see this line. It divides this body into the front and back. So it's a plane that runs vertically from top to bottom and divides the body into a front part or front side and a back posterior side. Remember, anterior is the front and posterior is the back. So let's look at some examples here. This right here is an example of the frontal or coronal plane. This is another type of plane, and this is another one. We're going to get to those, but I want you to see how the frontal plane is going to divide this body into the front part and the back part in the back there. All right. So this is another example of the frontal plane. Again, the frontal plane is going to divide the body into the front part and the back part. Okay, let's look at sagittal plane. Now, sagittal plane is a vertical plane, again, up and down, that divides the body into left and right proportions. So frontal plane divides the body into front and back, but sagittal plane divides the body into left and right proportions. So let's look at some examples. But before we get to that, let's talk about the median sagittal plane. The median sagittal plane divides the body into two equal halves. Okay, so let's look at some pictures. Remember, the sagittal plane is going to be a plane that is going to divide the body into the left and right region. So notice here, it's going to divide the body into left and right regions, right? This is another example of the sagittal plane. Again, its job is to divide the body into left and right regions. That's the job of the sagittal plane. Remember, frontal plane divides the body into front and back, and sagittal plane is going to divide the body into left and right regions, all right? Okay. This is also an example of the sagittal plane, again, dividing the body into left and right regions. That is sagittal plane. Now, let's talk about the transverse plane. So the transverse plane is going to be a horizontal plane, right? So that means left and right. And it's going to divide the body into the upper or the superior and the lower inferior portions. So the transverse plane is going to be a horizontal plane, left to right, that's going to divide the body into upper superior part and lower inferior portions. Okay, so let's look at the transverse plane. Again, it's a horizontal plane, right? Left to right. And it's going to divide the body into the superior region and then the inferior region. That's what we call it. Yes, the inferior or lower region. So upper region, superior, and then inferior regions would be the lower region. And what divides that? The transverse plane. And so let's look at these. I want you to tell me look at the other pictures and tell me which plane do we have in each one of these images. Let's start with the first one. This first one, we have a plane that divides the body into the left and right region. What do we call that plane that divides the body into left and right regions? That is definitely going to be the sagittal plane. Now we have this plane, and this plane divides the body into the front and back part, right? What do we call a plane that divides the body into front and back? That is definitely going to be the frontal plane. And finally, we have this plane that divides the body into upper superior part and lower inferior part. What do we call that plane? That's definitely the transverse plane. So hopefully you got all right. And let's combine them all together. And so we have the sagittal plane, we have the coronal plane or the frontal plane, and we have the transverse plane. Okay, so hopefully you have a better understanding of these things. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care, everyone. See you soon.